So we're going to have a look at the different lighting types or light types we can use in Cinema 4D, especially with Corona Renderer, but this is more or less true for all the different render engines out there and pretty much the same everywhere. So before we talk about the light types specifically, I want to talk a bit about different ways of lighting a scene in general. So there are more or less three ways to light your scene. So the first one is to use a physical light source, or also called an object light source, and it's basically the standard light sources of any given render engine. We can choose between different physical lights, but it's basically a light source which you would always also use in the real world. It could be the sunlight, it could be a light bulb, it could be a display shining light into your scene. So anything that is like an artificial light source. Then another thing you can use is you can make every object in your scene as a light source. And we then refer to this as a polygon light or a light material. So when you have an object in your scene, it's like a mesh, a polygon, you can apply a light material to it, and then it will shine light into your scene. Then third but not least, we have image-based lighting, or also called dome lighting or HDRI lighting. And this means that we use a dome. This can be like a 180-degree dome or a 360-degree dome, which goes all around your scene. And we place a texture or an image on this kind of dome, and then we use the image information to shine light into our scene. That's a very useful technique if you don't want to set up a lot of lighting in your scene, and for example you just want to render an outdoor exterior scene. We can just use, for example, an image which we took outside from the sky and make that as our image source. The HDRI stands for High Dynamic Range Image, and we come to this in a later video. But it basically just means it's an image with a higher dynamic range, so with more brightness information in it, and we usually use this kind of high resolution, high bit depth images to light our scenes. And of course you can also use a combination of all of those different things. And then you have typically three different scenarios which you want to light, or in which way you can light your scene. So the first thing would be an interior studio lighting setup. This is basically an artificial setup. You can do this to create product shots or anything which is not specifically placed in an interior scene or room. So the difference for the interior lighting setup would be, in an interior lighting setup, this would be, for example, to do architectural visualization of an interior. And usually we use windows to get the light into the scene, or maybe also a bit of artificial lighting in the room, but basically it's a combination of both of this. So in this case, or in this scenario, we would rather visualize an interior setup, and in the studio setup we would most probably visualize a product or something like that. And then we have the exterior lighting. This is basically an outdoor scene where we want to render something which is on the outdoors, and where sunlight and the sky lights our scene. The exemption, of course, is nighttime scenery. So when you do an outdoor exterior scene at nighttime, you would probably have some moonlight and some artificial lighting going on. So three ways to light a scene: physical standard light objects we can use from the render engine, polygon lights which use a light material which we apply to the polygons, or an image-based lighting approach. And we have basically three different setups we can use to light. Now let's have a closer look at different kind of light types. And here's a quick summarization of this. So for example, we have a point light, we have a spotlight, which is kind of what you know from theaters, where the light shines in a certain direction. We have an area light, which is like a rectangular shaped flat surface which will shine light in a certain direction but more diffusely than the spotlight. And then we have something like an infinite light. This is basically a sunlight where the light source is indefinitely far away, and we mostly use this as something for sunlight. So let's jump into Cinema 4D and have a look on different light types. I will use the radio for this. It's not textured or there's not any material applied to this for now, but that isn't necessary to do a basic light setup. One thing which I like to include here though is a backdrop, so that we don't have this radio flying in space. So I go to the asset manager of Cinema 4D and you can just type in backdrop, and then you will find this kind of backdrop thing, and you can just double click on it. And then you will have a backdrop in your scene, and it's something like a parametric object actually. So let's move that down a little bit, make sure the floor touches our radio here, and then you could change the settings of this kind of thing, so make it wider or higher or whatever, but I just leave it as it is, maybe move it a little bit more to the front. So this will give us a nice little studio background, and now let's test out a few lights. So what you want to open up is the frame buffer from Corona to render your images, and then we can see the results. So it's already rendering right now in the interactive mode. So let me start that again. So you want to make sure to use the interactive render if you want to test out a few things. And I will bring back that window in a second. But first of all, let us add our first light source. So let's start with the infinite light, or also the sunlight. So in the Corona renderer, the sunlight is basically a little helper for the infinite light. We can change the rotation of the sun, for example. And now if I bring back my render, you can see that we finally see something here and have a light in our scene. You might have to decrease the exposure in your post settings of your virtual frame buffer window. Otherwise it will be just overexposed and yeah, too bright. I also activated the plume and glare here just to give us a little bit more effect on the lights, which you will see in a second when we use some polygon lights or other light sources. So yeah, pretty much this is the Corona sun object. We can change the angle, and you can see that with decreasing the angle here, the light gets warmer and more like an evening setting. And if I move this straight up, it gets more desaturated and white. And now you can also see the hard shadow we get from the light source. And in the evening, the shadows get really, really long, but still kind of hard because it's like a sunny day without atmospheric scattering, etc. So yeah, that's basically what the infinite light source does. As you can see here, the light source is actually placed in the center of our scene, but you see this kind of ray going up. This is where the light source is actually coming from, but it doesn't matter where this light source is placed, so you don't have to move it around or anything, because the light source will be very, very far away, so the position in your scene doesn't play a role at all. All right, so in comparison, or in addition to the Corona sunlight, if we want to do an exterior scene, we would probably add a Corona sky. And let me bring that back up. I will even reduce this a little bit more, the exposure. So let's say we have minus 5.5. Because now with the Corona sky, we have even more light coming in, and thus leading to even more exposure of our image. So what the Corona sky does, let me just hide the backdrop here for a second. And if I go back to my render view, you can see we now have this sky here in our scene. We can even add something like clouds to our renderer. It's quite nice. You can choose which kind of position and altitude those clouds have, the amount of coverage, etc., etc. So it's quite nice if you want to simulate a sky, and you can also change the variety. You can change the amount of cirrus clouds, etc. But going back to the object itself, we have something which is turbidity. Let me change the cloud setting for this. This is basically, as you can see in the background, the gradient of the sky. So turbidity means basically how much particles and atmospheric scattering is in the air, and this will change that for a little bit. We also have sun linking, which is like automatically connects this kind of object to the corona sun. And I don't know if we can see it. It's a bit difficult here with my setup to show you, but this is where the sun is. So this sun position is our light source from the sun, and it's linked to our corona sky object. So bring back the backdrop in here, and yeah, I think there isn't too much about the corona sky here to say. I think, I don't know what the volume effect does actually. Maybe I'll find that out in another session. Okay, let's continue with the other light sources. Let's deactivate those for a second. So the render goes back to black because there's no light source now in our scene. And you find the corona light. This is the light bulb, and this will add like an artificial light source to our scene. So in the default setting, this is going to be an area light. And as you can see here, it's a bit in the way now, but you see we can get a nice diffuse light onto our object. And let me move this back a little bit and rotate it a little bit. And there we go. So what you can do if you don't want to see the light in your renderer, you can actually just deactivate it by unchecking the visible directly option, and then it will disappear from your camera, so we can actually look through it. But if you want to see it in your scene, and if I turn the camera around, you can actually see that the light source is now in our scene. And as you can see here in the front, it's very bright, and as we go further away from the light source, the light intensity will decrease. And that's actually this kind of inverse square law, and you will also find this in here. So this is kind of the formula which determines that the light intensity will decrease over distance by a square law, or inverse square law to be more precise. I think I mentioned this already in the beginning of the video. We can change the directionality of the light source, and by that create something like a spotlight effect. And of course we can change the size of our object. And as you can see, as soon as we decrease the size of our object, the light intensity will also decrease by a lot. And we should get harder shadows. Let's try that out. So I will increase the intensity by quite a lot. So now we have a small area shadow, area light, and you can see our shadows are quite hard. And now if I go back to a larger light source and reduce the intensity, you can see we have a very diffuse kind of shadow. We can also change the type here of the light. We can, for example, say that it should be a sector light. A sector light is something like a light bulb, but it's not like a complete 360-degree sphere, but it's rather something you can control here with the angle of this kind of thing. We can also say that this light type should be an object, and then we can say, should it be a sphere, a cube, or a cylinder in order to light our scene accordingly. So for example, if I pick cylinder, I could decrease the radius to, let's say, 1.5 and maybe 25 centimeter in length. Let's bump up the intensity a little bit. And that could be, for example, be like a neon light bulb. Let's move it a little bit closer to our radio, and there we go. Of course, you can also change the color of the light. So right here underneath the intensity, we have this kind of color picker where we can define and choose the color for our light. If you want to work with white light, you can also go to the temperature. And in here we can now set the temperature of the light in Kelvin. So for example, something like 7500 would give us a more cold bluish light, and something like 5000 would put it more in a warm direction. Of course, you can have as multiple light sources in your scene as you want, although render times might increase if you add light sources to your scene, so pay a little bit attention on how many you will add. So let's turn that light to the blue side, turn off the temperature. Maybe it's a bit too much. And as you can see, with adding different light colors in our scene, we kind of can start to control the appearance of, or the look and feel of our scene. All right, so this is basically all we can do in Corona Render with artificial light sources. So we have the Corona light, and we can change the light type in here and set up our light as we wish to. Another thing we can do is we can use any object in our scene to be a light source. So let me add a sphere here to my scene, and it can be much smaller, maybe even smaller than that. So let's say we want this sphere to be our light source. What we have to do then is we have to create a light material. So in your material, go to Corona, light material, and this light material will be our light source then. And we have a very simple setup here. We only have basically the emission settings, and let's crank that up to maybe 100 to make it bright. And then we apply this light to our sphere, this light material to our sphere. And as you can see, it's barely visible now, so the light intensity is a little bit too less. So maybe let's go to 500. And then as you can see now, the light starts to illuminate our scene in here. Now, one thing to note is that if you add a physical material from Corona and we open that up, you will also find a self-illumination setting in this material. And what this means, it's basically also a way to light your scene, but render times can be much longer if you only use this kind of setting to light your scene. And there's also a warning here: do not use this feature as the main source in your scene. Use Corona light material instead. So this would something be what we use if we, for example, want to make a small indicator light on our radio, which should shine, but it's not a light which we use as a main light source in our scene. So if you want to light something in your scene with a polygon object, make sure to use the light material for that. Otherwise, render times might be much longer than needed. So we already had the sky object, and what I showed here is just the way how to use a polygon light, and it can be any shape you like it to be. Let's delete this for now, and let's come back to the sky here for a second to illustrate to you the last technique we can use to light our scene, and that's the image-based lighting. So when I activate the Corona sky, we're actually doing something like image-based lighting. So we have now the sky object lighting our scene, but in this case we don't have the sunlight activated now. So it's only the sky which will light our scene here. And as you can see already, with the bluish tint from the sky, we get a really nice lighting in our scene here, very homogeneous. But what we can also do is we can change the setting here in our Corona sky to shader HDRI. And by doing this, we can define an image, as mentioned before, which we will use as our HDRI image. So let's see in the asset manager if we can find an HDRI image here. So there are a few. So let's say we want to use this kind of interior scene to light our radio scene. So I click on the little download button here, might be a few megabytes, and then I drag and drop this into the shader field. And now I bring back my render or my virtual frame buffer. I change the exposure to go back to 0 again. As you can see, the light changed a little bit, and we now have this interior room scene as our light source for this kind of radio. So now the lighting in this rendering is exactly as the lighting which we would have if we are in this kind of room scenario. So you will find HDRI images here in the asset manager from Cinema 4D. You can let's try out another one maybe here to show you the difference maybe in light appearance. So this is how it looks now with the first HDRI, and I throw in the other one. As you can see, it gets much warmer because of the yellowish color of the walls in this kind of image. All right, so this is basically the overview of the different light setups we can do. So just to wrap that up shortly, we have the option to use a Corona sky in combination with the Corona sun in combination with the Corona sky. We can either use the physical sky from Corona to generate a sky for us, or we can use an HDRI image to define the lighting in our scene. That could either be for interior as well as for exterior scenes. So in the case of an exterior scene, we would pick an HDRI taken on the outside. So for example, this kind of image from the sky. And you might want to change also the intensity of your light source or of your HDRI image. So this takes quite a while to download now. Don't know why. Yeah, but anyhow. So exterior sky means that you want to have an exterior image in here. The other option would be the Corona light with the different options and light types you can pick from. And then you have also the option to use a light material and use a polygon object in your scene as a light source. For rendering, you don't have to set up anything. In Corona Renderer, you can just use the post settings here to change the exposure of your image to have it not under or overexposed. And when we have a look in the render settings of Corona, there is actually not much we can or we have to change. So you can just leave this as is, and in most cases only if you want to tweak a thing or other you want to go here into the settings. So that's very nice. You don't have to worry about any setting, and you can just place your light sources and just hit the render button to get a result.